Sometimes you encounter a story, a historical narrative that's just so um, deeply ingrained, it feels like. Well, like common sense, doesn't it?
Exactly. It's the standard answer you always hear.
Right, the default setting for a really big question. And for many, many people, particularly in Iran, the story of how Islam entered Iran and what happened right after, well, that's definitely one of those narratives.
It's a story that's told, widely accepted, and often, felt quite deeply, almost like personal history.
And right at the absolute heart of that narrative is a book, a really, really impactful book published, gosh, 70 years ago now, back in 1955. It's called Two Centuries of Silence.
Ah, yes, by Abdul Hossein Zarinkoob, a giant figure in 20th century Iranian scholarship, a professor whose work really shaped how generations understood their past.
Absolutely. And his book looks specifically at the fall of the Sassanid Empire and then dug into the political situation in those first couple of centuries after. So roughly, 650 to 850 AD.
That's right. And Zarinkoob's core claim, and this is what made the book so powerful, why it resonated so much, is that the Arab attack on Iran was, well, a profound tragedy, almost cataclysmic.
He really framed it that way.
He did. He argued that for 2 whole centuries after this invasion, Iranian identity, the culture, and especially the Persian language were utterly suppressed. Basically, they went silent.
Silent, yeah.
He pictured it as this period where the Muslim Arab conquerors were actively trying to dismantle, maybe even destroy, Iranian heritage. A deep, pervasive silence that, in his view, only really broke when Iranians could finally set up semi-independent and then later fully independent governments, reasserting their cultural voice, so to speak.
And the name itself, Two Centuries of Silence. It's just so clever, isn't it? So evocative.
He really is. Captures the imagination.
Exactly. Even if you haven't actually read the book, that phrase, that whole concept, it's profoundly shaped the basic understanding for countless Iranians about this absolutely pivotal time. It really became the standard view. For many, it still is.
But here's where it gets really interesting for us today.
Because today, our mission is to take a critical look, but a deeply respectful one, at this incredibly valuable, important book. We're not here to dismiss it. Certainly not.
No, definitely not. Not trying to discredit the author or his work.
Absolutely not. It's more about engaging in a conversation across time. A dialogue, if you like, spanning these 70 years of historical digging since he wrote it.
Yeah.
You see, historical narratives are always, and this is so important, they're influenced by the spirit of the times they're written in, whether we intend them to be or not.
Right. Context matters.
Hugely. New documents get unearthed, new archaeological evidence comes out of the ground, and, well, our perspectives just evolve, don't they? As historians, as societies, what seemed like the most important thing 70 years ago might not hold the same weight today, and vice versa. I like that idea of a conversation across time. Imagine all these historians arguing, agreeing, building on each other's work over centuries.
That's exactly it. And we, the listeners, were sort of sitting in on this huge academic debate, listening, observing.
And maybe, sometimes, adding our own bit based on new info. So, what have we learned in the 70 years since Zarinkoob wrote his book? What do we know now, thanks to new discoveries, new methods, that he just couldn't have known back then?
And what were we so sure about back then that maybe now, in 2025, we question or challenge or even have to, well, discard?
That's the exciting challenge, right? That's what we're diving into.
And to do that properly, we need to look systematically at 4 key areas. 4 places where modern scholarship offers really significant new insights that challenge and honestly profoundly expand on that prevailing narrative Zarinkoob helped establish.
Okay, what are they?
First, we'll do a major reevaluation of Iran before Islam arrived. Then we'll shift focus to Arabia before Islam going to have to unravel some deep misconceptions there.
Okay, pre-Islamic Iran, pre-Islamic Arabia.
That's right. Third, we'll scrutinize the actual story of Islam's entry into Iran. Look beyond that simple invasion idea. And finally, we'll dive deep into those very 2 centuries after Islam arrived, the period Zarinkoob called the Silence, to see what was really going on.
Okay, sounds like a plan. So everyone listening, get ready to stretch your mind a bit. Be mentally prepared to question some maybe long-held assumptions, perhaps even some cherished ideas about history.
Because this isn't just ticking off historical facts.
No, it's an intellectual journey, really, seeing familiar landscapes with new eyes. Okay, let's unpack this. Where do we start? Section 1, pre-Islamic Arabia.
Let's start there. Zarinkoob, and he was following a long tradition here, he portrayed pre-Islamic Arabia as, well, largely illiterate, savage, and uncivilized. That was the common phrasing.
Right, the idea that Islam just emerged from this void almost, a beacon of light in darkness.
Pretty much. A very clear binary picture.
Yeah.
Before Islam, darkness, ignorance. With Islam, civilization, enlightenment.
And you mentioned this aligns with later historical accounts.
Yes, it fits remarkably well with what we call salvation histories. These were accounts written often by 9th and 10th century Muslim historians. They depicted the pre-Islamic era as Jahiliyyah, the time of ignorance or barbarism.
And that served a purpose, presumably.
Oh, absolutely. A
Yeah.
specific, deliberate purpose. It highlighted Islam's transformative power. It presented Islam as the force that rescued people from this supposedly barren, chaotic past, bringing order, knowledge, morality. It underscored the massive impact of the new faith.
The modern challenge to that view, you said it's groundbreaking.
It really is. Thanks to decades of painstaking work by archaeologists and especially epigraphists, the people who study ancient inscriptions.
Right, inscriptions, what have they found?
Literally thousands of stone inscriptions, meticulously found, dug up, translated all across the Arabian Peninsula. And what they show is, frankly, astonishing.
Which is?
A surprisingly high level of literacy among what looked like very ordinary people in pre-Islamic Arabia.
Ordinary people, not just like priests or kings.
Exactly. This directly, powerfully contradicts that old idea of widespread illiteracy. We're not just talking about a few scholars here. We're seeing evidence of literacy being part of daily life for many.
Wow. Okay. So inscriptions prove literacy. What else?
Well, the picture that emerges is just so much more complex. These inscriptions, they're on everything. Rock faces, grave markers, even personal messages carved on stone. It suggests people from various walks of life, merchants, soldiers, maybe even herders could read and write.
And was it all in early Arabic?
No, and that's another key point. We found evidence of many different languages, different scripts too. Some we're still trying to decipher properly.
Like what?
Well, the influence of Syriac, for instance, that's an Aramaic dialect, was huge. Not just a religious language, but
Right.
a major language for trade and culture across the Fertile Crescent and right down into Arabia.
So people were multilingual, multi-script.
It seems very likely. Some scholars even suggest that if the Prophet Muhammad himself encountered a version of the Bible, given the linguistic situation then, it was probably a Syriac version. That paints a picture so far removed from linguistic barrenness or an intellectual vacuum.
Okay, so literacy, linguistic diversity. What about the uncivilized part, the political organization?
Yeah, that uncivilized notion also takes a big hit when you look closely. The idea of just fragmented, chaotic tribes always fighting each other. It doesn't hold up. There were established kingdoms in Arabia.
Kingdoms, like proper states.
Yes, established kingdoms. Think of Yemen in the south, the Himyarite kingdom, for example. These were far from insignificant or primitive.
And they could exert power.
Absolutely. These internal Arabian powers were sophisticated enough to expand, to consolidate large areas, to run complex administrative systems. That demonstrates a level of political and social organization that just blows the savage label out of the water.
And what about the big empires nearby? The Romans, the Sassanids?
That's another crucial piece of evidence. All the surrounding empires, Aemenids, Parthians, Sassanids, Rome, even Abyssinia, they all made significant, often costly efforts to control parts of Arabia or influence its tribes.
Why would they bother if it was just chaos?
Exactly. Why invest resources if the region was truly insignificant or totally uncivilized? Their constant interventions show Arabia's strategic importance, its role in trade routes, and a level of organized resistance or potential cooperation that contradicts that image of a disorganized tribal mess.
Okay, fascinating. What about religion then? The standard picture is just paganism, right? Idol worshippers.
Ah, that simplistic view. Some historians now call it a scary fallacy. That idea that everyone was just a pagan worshipping statues.
A scary fallacy. Why scary?
Because it's an oversimplification with real consequences. It stops us from properly understanding the other, the actual people and societies of pre-Islamic Arabia. And subtly, it stops us understanding ourselves, the complex evolution of beliefs. It's often us projecting modern ideas backwards onto complex ancient spiritualities.
What was the reality?
The reality was a vibrant mosaic of faiths. We know there were distinct Zoroastrian communities, especially in the east and south, with Sassanid influence.
Zoroastrians in Arabia.
Definitely. And well-established Jewish communities, especially in places like Yathrib, which later became Medina. And a significant number of Christians,
Christians too. Where?
not just in the north, like the Ghassanids and Lakhmids bordering Byzantium and Persia, but also widespread in the south, in Yemen, where Christianity was deeply rooted. So this wasn't some religious void waiting for Islam to fill it. It was a diverse, active, intellectually buzzing religious environment where monotheistic traditions already had a strong foothold.
So just to recap this section then, this reevaluation of pre-Islamic Arabia. Why does it profoundly matter? Why should you, listening, care that Zarinkoob's view isn't quite the full story anymore?
The core takeaway is this. Pre-Islamic Arabia wasn't a cultural or intellectual desert, not by a long shot. It was bustling, literate, politically organized, and religiously diverse.
And that changes everything about how we see Islam emerging.
Fundamentally, it suggests Islam was less a light appearing in total darkness and more a powerful evolution within an already vibrant, interconnected world of ideas, cultures, and established power dynamics.
So clinging to the old, simpler image actually hinders understanding.
It can create a subconscious resistance to new data, yeah. Makes it harder to grasp the complexities of the past and the present. It forces us to ask, how does this more complex picture change our understanding of Islam's beginnings? Was it a total break or a dynamic new thing emerging within an already sophisticated, surprisingly globalized world?
The answers seem much more complex than we thought. Okay, let's pivot now. Section 2. Sassanid Iran itself, right on the eve of Islam's emergence.
Right. And here, the dominant narrative, the one Zarinkoob shared, but also many others, leftists, Islamists, nationalists, is that the Sassanid Empire was basically rotten from the inside by its end.
Yeah, the House of Cards idea, ready to collapse.
Exactly. The specific claims were always about decay. Economic bankruptcy, military weakness, intellectual stagnation, social breakdown. The idea was the Sassanids were so eaten away by termites, metaphorically speaking.
And that the Arabs just had to give it a final push.
Precisely. They just flipped the switch on a system already dying. It helped explain how such a seemingly mighty empire fell so fast.
But you're saying newer narratives challenge this.
Massively. Based on new archaeology, rereading texts, there's just no academic consensus anymore that the Sassanid Empire was totally bankrupt. Many historians argue it hadn't collapsed economically, militarily, socially, or intellectually.
So what was the situation, if not total decay?
Well, to grasp it, we need to rewind a bit, maybe a century and a half before Islam's rise, to the mid-5th century, to the reign of King Kobad, who took power in 488 AD.
Kobad, what's his story?
It's pretty amazing, actually. He started from the bottom, literally. Spent years as a hostage of the Heptali fierce enemies of Iran, sometimes called the White Huns.
A hostage became king.
He did. He came back to Ctesiphon with Heptali military backing, reclaimed the throne, and then ruled for a really long time, 40, maybe 43 years.
Wow. And what did he do in those 4 decades? Just hang on.
Far from it. He enacted huge reforms, political, social, economic. He shifted the empire's military focus away from the northeast, the Heptali, towards the west, dealing with the Romans, Byzantines and Armenia, Iraq, Mesopotamia. A major strategic change. That's not decay, that's active statecraft.
And socially.
He tackled the huge class gaps in Sassanid society. Controversially, he used the Mazdak movement, a sort of proto-socialist religious group advocating wealth redistribution.
He supported them. The elite must have hated that.
They did. But Kobad used Mazdak to break the power of the entrenched aristocracy and maybe the Zoroastrian priesthood, redistributing assets to lower classes, strengthening his own central authority, and militarily. He even reclaimed Khorasan from the Heptali. He turned a weakened kingdom into a powerhouse for his son.
And his son was Khosrow Anushirvan, the famous one.
The very same. The just king. And crucially, the Prophet Muhammad was born during Anushirvan's long, prosperous reign. Anushirvan didn't just sit back. He continued and completed his father's big tax reforms. Detailed land surveys, a fixed land tax. This strengthened the economy, funded a strong military. This is state building, not crumbling.
And his military successes, weren't they significant?
Hugely significant. He definitively defeated the Heptali, securing the east. And his campaigns against the Byzantines were triumphant. There's that famous story.
The swimming story.
Yes. After conquering deep into Byzantine land, he reaches the Mediterranean, takes off his clothes, swims in it. It wasn't just for fun. It was a massive symbolic act.
Declaring Persian power reached the Roman Sea.
Exactly, saying, we're here now. It showed Sasanian power extending right across the known world. Peak strength, not decline.
And economically, was it just military spending?
No, Anushirvan focused heavily on agriculture too. Irrigation projects, new canals, better crop rotation. The chronicles talk about overflowing granaries, supporting a growing population, a solid tax base. These are clear signs of a thriving economy, not a failing one.
So this strong foundation persisted.
It absolutely did. It set the stage for Khosrow Parviz, Anushirvan's grandson, ruling in the early 7th century. During his reign, the Sassanid army reached its absolute zenith.
This is right before the Islamic conquest.
Right before, they took huge chunks of the Eastern Byzantine Empire, Damascus, Jerusalem, even Egypt. They twice reached the actual walls of Constantinople, around 610, 620 AD. These are absolutely not the actions of a collapsing empire.
It's amazing timing, isn't it, that the Prophet Muhammad's move towards political order, the Hijra around 622, happened exactly when the Sassanids were so strong and Byzantium was reeling.
It's a fascinating geopolitical backdrop. The world was dominated by this incredibly powerful Sassanid state.
And the idea of economic bankruptcy. Any final nail in that coffin?
Well, here's something really telling. Even after Khosrow Parviz was overthrown and executed by his own elites, the Sassanid treasury was still so incredibly full that the nobles spent months arguing fiercely over how to divide it up.
They were fighting over the loot, basically.
Pretty much. That's not a kingdom running on empty. It was a wealthy state whose riches became a prize in the power struggle.
So if it wasn't internal rot, what did cause the downfall? This is the core question, right?
Exactly. And the newer understanding is this. The Sassanids didn't crumble slowly. They were decapitated, suddenly, brutally, by an internal crisis.
Decapitated? How?
Khosrow Parviz was overthrown and killed in 628 AD, a coup by his own disgruntled elites led by a general. This kicked off an immediate, rapid, violent succession crisis. The Sassanid royal family was basically wiped out.
Wiped out? How fast?
In less than 10 years, between 628 and the fall of Ctesiphon in 637, an unbelievable 7 kings and even 2 queens, Puranek and Azarmidok, sat on the throne.
7 rulers in under a decade.
Yes. Most ruled for just months before being killed or ousted. Think about that. The dynasty, the symbol of legitimacy, was practically extinct before the main Islamic armies even got to the Iranian heartland.
So the head was gone.
Precisely. The top of the pyramid was destroyed. It created this massive power vacuum, a legitimacy crisis. But, and this is crucial, the lower administrative levels, the bureaucracy, the tax system, local governance, they largely remained intact.
So it wasn't the whole structure collapsing, just the very top.
Exactly. It redefines the collapse. It wasn't a crumbling building. It was a decapitated body, unable to mount a unified defense because its head, its legitimate authority, was gone.
Okay, that completely changes the picture.
Yeah.
So we've got a more complex Arabia, a Sassanid empire decapitated rather than decayed. Now let's tackle the entry of Islam itself, Section 3.
Right. The common perception, fueled by dramatic stories, is Muslim Arabs, fired up by faith, sweeping in with lightning speed, crushing the Iranians, conquering lands, destroying the Sassanid order, and replacing it wholesale.
The unstoppable wave idea.
Pretty much. But when we dig into the details, it gets way more complex than a simple invasion. One really striking thing is geographic overlap.
Overlap? What do you mean?
If you map the early Muslim conquests, especially just west of the Iranian plateau, they look remarkably similar to the areas Khosrow Parviz, the Sassanid king we just talked about, had just taken from Byzantium before the Sassanid collapse.
Wait, so the Muslims were taking land? The Sassanids had only recently conquered themselves.
In many cases, yes. It suggests that what looked like brand new conquests might have actually been, in part, a reoccupation of territory that was already in flux, shifting from Byzantine to Sassanid, and now shifting again. Pre-existing alliances likely played a huge role.
That's a massive point. Not always new ground. What about the Arabs themselves? Were they purely an external force?
No, and that's another critical piece often missed. Arab groups like the Lakhmids, based near Herba, were significant integrated parts of the Sassanid army for a long time. They fought for the Sassanids against Byzantium.
So Arabs were already part of the Sassanid military machine.
Definitely. And there's even the pre-Islamic Battle of Decay, where some Arab tribes actually defeated a Sassanid force. It shows a complex, sometimes adversarial, but always intertwined relationship long before Islam.
So the lightning speed maybe wasn't just about military genius, but also about internal dynamics.
Perhaps better understood, especially in that first wave, not as a purely new conquest by a totally foreign force, but as a shift in allegiance within existing structures, filling that power vacuum we talked about.
So,
The Sassanid military forces, leaderless after the dynastic purges, were in disarray. They needed a reference point, a source of legitimacy, especially if they could keep their status. The shift was from the defunct Sassanid family in Ctesiphon to the prophet's successors in Medina, and then significantly to Kufa.
Kufa, where's that relevant?
Kufa is very near Hira, the old Lakhmian capital, the capital of those Arab allies of the Sassanids. This suggests more of a transition of power at the top, maybe incorporating existing forces, rather than a complete societal overthrow.
That makes so much more sense. It wasn't just simple conquest. Which leads to another huge simplification, this idea of two totally separate opposing identities. Iranian Persian versus Arabic. Was that even a thing back then, like we think of nationality today?
Not really, no. And this is absolutely vital. The idea that linguistic and racial identities were as rigid and mutually exclusive as we imagine them now, it's just not accurate for the 7th century.
People moved around more. Identities were fluid.
Exactly. People moved, boundaries were porous, identities were layered. For instance, Arab tribes had been settled inside the Sassanid Empire for over 300 years, since Shapur Dulaktaf around 350 AD.
Settled within Iran. Where?
In places like Kerman, Khuzestan, Sistan, often as border guards, part of local governance. And many of these tribes were Christian, many spoke Syriac. They were integrated into the Sassanid world.
So when the Muslim forces arrived,
evidence suggests these settled Arab tribes were likely among the very first to join them. Not as foreign invaders joining other foreigners, but as internal groups shifting their allegiance to a new rising power, perhaps one they felt closer to linguistically or culturally in some ways.
so the whole picture of a clear invading Arab army versus a unified Iranian population just dissolves.
It becomes much, much blurrier. These were people who'd lived within the Sassanid system for centuries, speaking different languages, complex loyalties. Not a simple us versus them based on modern ethnicity.
And you mentioned Syriac was important.
Yes, Syriac played this vital role as a lingua franca, a go-between language, not just geographically, but between different ethnic and religious groups. And even the word Arab itself.
About it.
The term Arab back then often just meant desert wanderer or nomad, sometimes with a rural, maybe slightly negative connotation. It wasn't necessarily a fixed racial identity like we think of it today. The term Arabi was more linked to the Quran itself, to eloquence, the purity of the Quranic language rather than race.
So racial identity wasn't the main dividing line.
It really doesn't seem to have been the primary driver for most people, Sasanian subjects or early followers of the Prophet. That concept of a distinct racial linguistic identity of Arabic marking a separate Arab nation seems to develop much later. Maybe in the Umayyad period as the empire consolidated, or even later. It wasn't foundational at the time of the conquests.
So wrapping up this section, the invasion is better seen
as a change in the upper layer of administration happening amidst complex, pre-existing ethnic and linguistic mingling. The political structure changed hands, but the underlying social fabric, with its interwoven identities, largely continued. This helps explain why there wasn't an immediate, clear identity fight, as we might imagine through a modern lens. The very categories were still forming. It totally reframes the entry of Islam into Iran.
Right. Okay, this brings us smack bang into Zarinkoob's title, 2 Centuries of Silence,
Yeah.
Section 4. The prevailing view, whether you see it as tragic suppression like Zarinkoob, or maybe growth and redemption like some other narratives,
Is that these 2 centuries, roughly 650 to 850 AD, were a time of great transformation. Society turned upside down by the new Islamic order.
But both those views, the tragic and the redemptive, are based on that modern idea of distinct identities clashing, right? Iranians versus Arabs, Zoroastrians versus Muslims.
Largely, yes. Which, as we've just discussed, wasn't quite the reality on the ground then. But here's the fascinating thing from contemporary scholarship.
Go on.
There seems to have been significant continuity, socially, economically, politically, across these 2 centuries. In many crucial ways, the before and after are not as different as you might think.
Oh, continuity after such a huge political shift. That challenges the whole turned upside down idea. How can we say that?
Let's look at political and administrative continuity first. It's quite remarkable. Some scholars argue convincingly that the court, the political systems of Khosrow Anushirvan, the Sassanid king, are actually closer in structure and style to those of Mamun Abbasi, a major Abbasid caliph in the 9th century, than they are to Ardashir Babkan, the Sassanid founder centuries earlier.
closer to the later caliph than the earlier Sassanid founder. What does that imply?
It implies a profound preservation and adaptation of administrative structures. The lower layer, the bureaucracy doing the day-to-day work, tax collection, irrigation, local justice. The very same families, like the famous Barmakids or others with Sassanid roots who served the Sassanid emperors, demonstrably continued to serve under the Abbasid Caliphate.
The same people kept their jobs, basically.
In many cases, yes. The essential functions of the state were preserved, adapted. It was like a corporate takeover, new CEO. But middle management and operations largely stay the same, just under new ownership.
Okay, administration continued. But language, culture, that was Zarinkoob's core point, the silence of Persian. Surely that changed drastically.
Here, too, the picture is much more nuanced than just silence. Evidence shows Pahlavi Middle Persian, the direct ancestor of modern Persian, continued to be used widely.
Used for what?
For official records in some areas, personal letters, business accounts, especially on the central Iranian plateau well into the 8th century. Zoroastrian solar dates were still common on documents. Traditional things like wine production persisted, sometimes with Pahlavi labels.
So Pahlavi didn't just vanish overnight.
Not at all. Its shift to Dari or New Persian seems to have been a gradual, organic, linguistic evolution, not a sudden break forced by conquerors. Arabic certainly spread, yes. It became the major intellectual and administrative language of the empire, often replacing Syriac in that role. But it didn't eradicate Persian.
So no sharp dividing line.
No clear moment when Middle Persian ended and New Persian began. It was a continuum. Regional dialects show more continuity than hard breaks. It was a natural flow.
So the silence Zarinkoob talked about, maybe it was more specific.
Precisely. Some scholars now argue the silence might really only apply to the imperial caliphate court, where, yes, for a time, Persian poetry wasn't commissioned or patronized like it had been under the Sassanids.
It's outside the court.
Outside the court, Pahlavi thrived as the religious language for Zoroastrians, and far from being silent, they produced very important books during this exact period.
Important Zoroastrian books during the silence.
Yes, including two of the most significant texts of modern Zoroastrianism, the Denkard, this huge encyclopedia of religious knowledge, and the Bundahushin, a key cosmological text. And guess where some of these were compiled?
Where?
In Baghdad, the Abbasid capital.
Wow, so for Zoroastrians, it wasn't silence, it was formation.
Exactly. It was paradoxically a period of crystallization, intellectual energy, codifying their traditions, often in dialogue with the new dominant faith, Islam.
That's a massive reframe. So instead of silence, it was more like intellectual uproar, a fertile time.
Absolutely. Think about it. Modern Zoroastrianism, much like the Jewish Talmud codified after the temple's destruction, largely took its definitive shape in these first 2 centuries after Islam's arrival, often in vigorous debate with Islam, sometimes aligning, sometimes opposing, but always in conversation.
And Islam itself was being shaped too.
Yes. The very monotheistic identity of Islam, how Muslims understood their own monotheism, was largely formed and refined in conversation with the views of the Zoroastrians, Christians, and Jews they lived amongst. It was a mutual shaping process in this incredibly rich intellectual environment.
So foundational Islamic thought didn't just pop up fully formed.
Not at all. This period saw the foundational debates in Islamic philosophy and theology. Big questions. Good versus evil, God's nature, free will versus divine will, divine justice. These were hashed out by scholars from diverse backgrounds.
Leading to different schools of thought.
Exactly. These debates led to schools like the rationalist Mu'tazila and the solidification of legal schools like Hanafi and Shafi. Jurisprudence, Sharia traditions, they solidified not just in Islam, but also in Zoroastrian, Jewish, and Christian communities, adapting to the new reality. New literary forms emerged for all these traditions.
And you mentioned cultural exchange, not just one-way influence.
Definitely. Fascinating examples. Things like Waqf, the Islamic system of charitable endowments, show strong influence from older Persian and Zoroastrian traditions of pious foundations. Even aspects of early Islamic law on apostasy seem to echo Sasanian legal concepts. There was real dialogue, a dynamic fusion.
And all this intellectual activity needed fuel, right?
Yeah.
Which brings us to,
The Great Translation Movement.
right, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad.
Yeah.
Abbasid Golden Age stuff.
Exactly. Now, translation wasn't new. The Sassanids under Anushirvan translated works too, but under the Abbasids, it exploded in scale. Arabic had become standardized, refined as this high-level intellectual language, so they launched this massive state-sponsored project to translate Greek philosophy, Persian science, Indian math, medical texts into Arabic.
So the scale was unprecedented.
Utterly. It wasn't just the translation itself, but the institutional backing, the use of Arabic as the primary vehicle. It created this incredibly vibrant world of thought. Extensive dialogue, cross-pollination, and honestly, a remarkable degree of intellectual freedom for the time.
And this intellectual ferment fueled politics, too.
Deeply. It fed into political ideas, movements like Abu Muslim Khorasanis that brought the Abbasids to power, or later resistance movements like Babak Khorramdin's. These weren't just rebellions. They often expressed distinct political philosophies challenging the central authority.
So coming back to identity,
Yeah.
this period wasn't primarily about an Iranian versus Arab ethnic clash.
It really doesn't look like it, not in our modern racial sense.
Okay.
Conflicts like Babak's uprising were complex, political, economic, maybe religious, about power dynamics. Much like earlier Sassanid crackdowns like Anushirvan versus the Mazdakis. Given all the linguistic and ethnic mixing over centuries, it's just unlikely that language and race were the main identity markers for most people then.
So what we see in these 2 centuries is continuity, adaptation, intellectual explosion, rather than silence or total rupture.
That's the picture emerging from recent scholarship, yes. Deep continuity in administration, profound intellectual ferment building on existing traditions, and adaptive change, not a blanket of silence.
Okay, what a journey we've been on. We started talking about Zarinkoob's incredibly influential book, 2 Centuries of Silence, written 70 years ago, how it framed Islam's entry into Iran as this deep tragedy, leading to centuries of cultural silence.
And we've carefully peeled back those layers. Not to dismiss his vital work at all, but to enrich it with everything we've learned since new discoveries, new perspectives, tools he just didn't have.
We saw pre-Islamic Arabia wasn't illiterate or uncivilized, but complex, literate, politically organized, religiously diverse, challenging that whole light in the darkness idea.
And we challenged the view of a Sassanid empire rotten from within.
Yeah.
Showed it was strong economically, militarily, intellectually, right up until that sudden, brutal internal crisis, the decapitation, not decay.
Right. Then the lightning conquest looked more nuanced, partly reoccupying land, involving internal allies, filling a power vacuum after that decapitation, and the whole idea of separate Iranian versus Arab identities just didn't fit the fluid reality back then.
Exactly. And finally, we dove into the 2 centuries of silence themselves, revealed that far from silence, it was a time of huge continuity in administration, natural language evolution, and this incredible uproar of intellectual and religious development for Zoroastrians and for foundational Islamic thought. Dialogue and innovation, not suppression.
So the value of doing this, of reevaluating, it's crucial, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It shows why we constantly need to go back to history, look again, put on new glasses, refine our understanding. Zarinkoob, writing 70 years ago, was inevitably influenced by his time, the 20th century.
How so?
His understanding of Iranian identity was deeply tied to 20th century ideas about Persian language, Aryan connections. His work reflected that national spirit after the Constitutional Revolution, the Pahlavi drive to build a modern nation-state. That was a global trend then.
And that led him to emphasize certain contrasts.
Like many intellectuals then, he tended to create an other out of what he saw as the Arab racial identity and language, setting it against the Iranian concept, a dichotomy that resonated with the nationalism of his era. For him, silence meant specifically the lack of an independent Iranian government, the lack of Persian court poetry.
Even though, as we saw, other cultural life was thriving.
He knew that, yes. But his focus, shaped by his time, was on those specific absences. So, the updated consensus now among historians in 2025 is that the image of Iran being totally turned upside down culturally, religiously, intellectually, linguistically, causing 2 centuries of silence, is just not really an acceptable description anymore, or at least not the consensus view. History's a living conversation, always open to new evidence, new interpretations.
And the courage to question what we thought we knew. So what does all this mean for you listening right now? We've just spent time revisiting a story many of us took as gospel. This process, revisiting, reevaluating history, challenging those established truths, it isn't just about getting the past right. It's a vital skill for navigating today, isn't it? For seeing nuance, for understanding how narratives get shaped by their time, even the well-meaning ones.
Absolutely. Think about it. How many other truths might you take for granted? Historical ones, scientific ones, social ones?
What new discoveries, what surprising insights might be waiting if you apply that same critical lens elsewhere?
It's an ongoing process.
Definitely. This era, these questions of identity, power, cultural exchange, we are far from done with them. We will certainly talk about this era and these questions again.
Show, let's go, open up your mind and grow. Facts and stories, things you never know. Every episode, we light the glow. Step into the world of Mass Show. Turn it up, let the rhythm flow. Feel the beat, take control. Don't be shy, just let it go. This is where the magic grows. Tune in now, it's the Mass Show. Lights up bright and minds will glow. Every day we learn and grow. Come along and join the flow. New ideas begin to shine. Breaking limits, crossing lines. Every moment feels divine. In the world of Mass Show time. Turn it up, let the rhythm flow. Feel the beat, take control. Don't be shy, just let it go. This is where the magic grows. Tune in now, it's the Mass Show. Lights up bright and minds will glow. Every day we learn and grow. Come along and join the flow.